The Twisted Murders of Martha Agnew and Tammy Niver, a gruesome tale of deception. Hook. What happens when the darkness you've been running from finally catches up? In this chilling tale, follow Martha's terrifying journey as she discovers the truth about the house that wouldn't let go. With every step, the line between reality and nightmare blurs, leading her to a horrifying encounter that no one could have predicted. Will she survive? Or will the darkness consume her? Stay with us, because the shocking truth is only revealed at the end. Don't blink, because this isn't the story you think it is. Martha Agnew could feel the air shift. It wasn't just cold. It was sharp. A bite. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it stung the skin on her neck. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. But it was the silence inside the house that gripped her. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, making you question if you were truly alone. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart a drum in her chest. The hallway stretched long and dark, a black throat swallowing light. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way toward the kitchen. The floor creaked under her weight. Another gust of wind sent the curtains billowing inward. She reached for the light switch, but her hand froze just before contact. A soft sound, almost too faint to be real. A whisper? She thought she heard something, but then the house was silent again. Her breathing picked up, a tickle in her throat. Her eyes scanned the room. Nothing. Her mind was playing tricks. It had to be. But why did the air feel so thick? Like it had been holding its breath. She stepped toward the counter, hands trembling. The knife. It had always been there. Shiny. Staring at her like it knew. But tonight it seemed off. A shadow. Dark and still. The hairs on the back of her neck stood. A soft scrape of metal on wood. A chill ran through her spine. She turned slowly. Nothing. The knife hadn't moved. But she could still feel it. Watching her. Waiting. Martha's pulse thundered in her ears. Her breath came quick. The silence clung to her like a second skin. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Behind her. Her body froze. She didn't dare turn. Not yet. The steps were slow. Deliberate. The temperature dropped another degree. It felt like ice against her skin. She didn't have to look to know they were there. Behind her. Staring. Waiting. Her legs wouldn't move. Her body was trapped. The sound of a breath. Sharp and shallow. Then, the whisper again. So close. She could feel it on her skin. The words were indistinguishable. But she understood them anyway. A threat. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. It was coming. She knew it. Martha Agnew's heart stopped. The knife. It was no longer in place. It was in someone's hand. Her hand. Or theirs. The floor cracked underfoot. And the whisper turned to a scream. The scream pierced through the stillness, jagged and raw. It tore through her, paralyzing her from the inside out. Her legs buckled, but she couldn't move. The air was thick now, suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in. A footstep. Then another. Slow. Measured. The shadow in the corner of her eye shifted. A shape, no longer just a blur. It was real. It was there. The figure stood just behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, strangled. The whisper was louder now, crawling into her ears. Cold fingers brushed her neck. She gasped, her eyes wide, her body trembling. The knife. She could feel it, pressed to her back. She couldn't move. Not an inch. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was him. Or her. The air was alive with menace. A low growl rumbled in her chest. Martha wanted to scream, but her throat was tight. Her mouth dry. The presence behind her was suffocating. Closer now. She could smell it. A faint metallic scent. It made her stomach churn. Then a voice. So soft. So close. Don't scream. Don't make a sound. Her pulse was a hammer against her ribs. Do you hear me? She nodded, slowly. The knife pressed harder. Martha could feel the cold steel digging into her skin. Then, the figure moved. In a blur. She didn't see it, but she felt it. The weight shifted. A hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her away from the counter. The room spun. Everything blurred. She tried to fight. But her limbs felt heavy. Like they were filled with concrete. Her heart thudded painfully. The cold air turned to ice. It seeped into her bones. The figure was strong. The grip on her wrist unyielding. It dragged her toward the door. No. She couldn't breathe. Not now. She stumbled. Fighting the pull, her feet caught on the rug. She almost fell. But someone, caught her. A sharp breath against her ear. "I'll make it quick," the voice whispered. The door creaked open. Darkness outside. Martha could see nothing. Only the heavy breath beside her. Then a sound. A car door. Slamming shut. The figure's grip loosened. She stumbled forward. Her mind was a haze. Her legs refused to cooperate. But she didn't fall. Not yet. She had to move. Her body felt numb. A low thud echoed behind her. Then, the world tilted. She hit the ground hard. The world spun. Flashes of light. A blur of faces. But nothing made sense. Only the terror. Only the shadow. Only the whisper that followed her into the night. And then, silence. Martha's eyes snapped open, but the world was still spinning. Her chest heaved for air, but it felt distant, as though she were underwater. Her hands pressed against the cold ground, struggling to push herself up. The darkness was overwhelming, thick like tar. She felt her way forward, fingers brushing against rough, uneven ground. Her head pounded with each beat of her heart. She couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in her ears. Her vision blurred. She had to focus. Had to move. A low groan escaped her lips, but the sound felt foreign. Her mouth was dry, cracked. The smell of dirt and decay filled her nose. She was outside. But where? The ground beneath her feet was soft, spongy. Grass or mud? She couldn't tell. It didn't matter. She needed to run. She needed to escape. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. They were stiff. Weak. A faint light flickered in the distance. A house? No. Not the house. Not that place. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog, but it only thickened. A crackling sound. A footstep. No. Not a footstep. A shadow. It moved low to the ground, shifting closer. Her breath caught in her throat. The hair on her arms stood on end. She wasn't alone. She wasn't alone. Martha lurched forward, a desperate scramble. Her fingers dug into the dirt, but she couldn't gain any ground. Her knees buckled beneath her. And then, a hand cold as ice grasped her ankle. She screamed, but the sound was muffled by the thick night air. A figure rose from the ground in front of her, its face hidden in the shadows. It leaned down, its breath hot against her skin. The whisper again, sending a chill through her spine. "I warned you." The voice was low, familiar. Her stomach dropped. Martha's pulse hammered in her neck. Her thoughts scrambled, but one thing became clear. It wasn't over. The nightmare had only just begun. Her body refused to move. Frozen in terror. Then, the figure rose completely. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating her. Martha gasped for breath, her chest tight. The ground felt uneven, as if it were shifting beneath her. The hand at her ankle pulled tighter. There was no escape. The shadows seemed to close in on her. The whispers surrounded her, deafening. Martha's vision swam again, fading in and out. She could barely keep her eyes open. Her head was heavy. Everything felt distant. Her body didn't belong to her anymore. It felt like she was sinking. Sinking deeper into the earth. Into something darker. A voice echoed in her mind. But it wasn't her own. "You'll never escape." And then, a sharp pain, like fire. A searing heat spread through her chest. And just before everything went dark, Martha Agnew knew. She knew she wasn't going to make it out alive. The pain exploded through her chest, searing. A jagged wave that tore at her insides. Martha gasped, but there was no air. Her body trembled violently, the darkness closing in, thick and suffocating. Her breath was shallow, each inhale a struggle. The hand on her ankle tightened, pulling her deeper into the earth. It was as if the ground itself was hungry. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost. Her throat was raw, choked by the thick, stifling air. The figure loomed over her, its face still hidden in shadows. But she knew it was there. She could feel it. Her limbs felt like lead. Heavy. Unmoving. A metallic taste flooded her mouth. She coughed, the world spinning, tilting. The ground beneath her seemed to shift again, crumbling away. Martha's hands scraped against the dirt, but it offered no purchase. She was falling. Falling into something darker than night itself. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping, surrounding her. Asterisk, you're not alone. You never were. Asterisk. A laugh. Low. Cold. It echoed in her mind, taunting her, mocking her helplessness. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. It was all too much. Her vision blurred. Everything around her distorted. Was this death? Was this what it felt like? A dark shape shifted above her. Closer. So close now, she could feel its breath. Hot. Heavy. A soft chuckle followed. Did you think you could escape? The voice, so familiar yet twisted, sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. A chorus. The shadows seemed to writhe, pulling at her, tightening around her like ropes. Her chest tightened again. The pain flared. Her body jerked involuntarily. It was as if every nerve in her body was on fire. I told you you wouldn't leave. The whispers were all-consuming now, echoing in every direction. She couldn't tell where they were coming from, only that they were everywhere. Tighter. Closer. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling to stay open. The figure loomed over her, impossibly tall. Martha's mind felt like it was unraveling. There were flashes, brief, flickering images. The house. Tammy's face. The knife. The blood. Her own blood. Her breath caught in her throat again. What had she done? The truth, faint but undeniable, began to press against her mind. Her body shook uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The shadows reached for her, their grip tightening. Her hands, her fingers, began to twitch. But they weren't her own. They were someone else's. Someone who had been here before. Her eyes widened in realization. It was her. She was already gone. The shadow above her was no longer alone. Dozens of hands reached for her. Grabbing. Pulling. Ripping her into the abyss. A final scream, raw, desperate, rang through the air. And then, just as quickly, it was silenced. The ground fell away completely. And Martha Agnew disappeared into the darkness forever. The silence was absolute. Still. Empty. Like the air itself had been swallowed whole. There was nothing now but the faint echo of her scream. It lingered, stretching thin in the distance. But even that faded into nothing. The place where Martha had fallen was now empty. Nothing stirred. The shadows remained, but they too seemed to hold their breath. Then, a distant sound, a car engine maybe. A door slamming shut. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. The world outside was still. The house stood silent, forgotten. The wind had stopped, leaving the trees motionless. But in the dark, something had shifted. Somewhere, in the deep, cold corners of the earth, there was movement. It was faint. Barely perceptible. A whisper. A breath. A sound too quiet to catch, yet unmistakable. And just as the night seemed to breathe its final sigh, another figure stepped out of the shadows. They were tall, their face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Their footsteps were measured, deliberate. They moved with a quiet purpose, like they had walked these paths before. Like they knew where to go. A hand reached out, brushing the dirt beneath the trees. Fingers lightly tracing the ground, following the marks left behind. There was no fear, no hesitation. Only the steady rhythm of the figure's movements. A breath, soft but sure. They crouched, fingers curling around something. A sharp, metallic gleam caught the faint light. The knife. It had been left behind. The very same knife. The one Martha had feared. The one that had cut into her flesh. But now it was calm. The cold blade gleamed like a reflection of the night. The figure stood, slowly rising. A shadow among shadows. They turned, walking back toward the house, their footsteps fading into the distance. It was all over. Martha Agnew was gone. But something was still there. A presence. A lingering force that wouldn't let go. As the figure disappeared into the darkness, the whispers returned. Faint, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't the end. Not yet. And somewhere, in the deep recesses of the night, a voice, low and guttural, spoke once more. You will know soon enough. The night closed in again. And the secrets buried in the dark began to stir. The night seemed to fold in on itself, growing heavier. The moon, once full and bright, was now hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The air was thick with tension, as if the very earth held its breath. There was a feeling of waiting. Of something just on the edge of perception. The house stood alone now. A dark, empty silhouette against the sky. The windows, black and hollow, stared out at nothing. It was a quiet, unsettling kind of stillness. But the quiet wasn't peace. It was something darker. Something that had been growing, patient. And it wasn't finished yet. A rustle, barely audible, sounded from inside the house. A shift. A creak of wood. The sound of something moving. But nothing was there. Not at first glance. The door, which had once hung open, was now quietly ajar. A sliver of light bled out from the cracks. Inside, shadows danced on the walls. A faint flicker of movement. But no one was there to cast them. The air inside felt wrong. It was thicker than it should be. Almost oppressive. The walls seemed to pulse. As if the house itself were alive, breathing. The faintest of whispers echoed in the corners. Low. Slight. But unmistakable. There was a presence here. Something had entered, or perhaps never left. A figure stood in the middle of the room, shrouded in darkness. It was impossible to make out their face, but their posture was still. Waiting. Watching. The flickering of a candle cast faint light across the floor, revealing something strange. A trail of blood. Fresh. Still glistening. It snaked across the floor, leading from the kitchen to the living room. A thin, crimson thread. No footsteps. No sign of a struggle. Just the blood. It led to the couch, where a figure now sat. A woman. Her eyes wide and vacant, staring into the darkness. Her lips parted in a silent scream. Tammy Niver. Her body was pale, lifeless. The blood was still pooling beneath her. But it wasn't just her. There was something else, an energy in the room. Something watching. Something that had claimed her soul. The whispering began again. It was louder now. Closer. The words were becoming clearer. You should have listened. The voice was familiar. It had been the same voice in Martha's ear, in the darkness. The same voice that had whispered promises of revenge, of truth. Of things long buried. The figure moved closer to Tammy. Their hand reached out, brushing against the woman's cheek. Cold. Dead. The fingers lingered for a moment. And then, Tammy's body jerked. Her eyes snapped open. They were no longer empty. They were filled with something else. Something ancient. The same presence that had taken Martha. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air thickened again, heavy with dread. Tammy rose from the couch, her body stiff and unnatural. Her movements were jerky, as though her limbs no longer belonged to her. The whispers grew louder. They filled the room, the house, the entire night. "You're not alone," the voice said again, this time cold and certain. "You never were." Tammy turned, her vacant eyes fixed on the doorway. She moved toward it. Each step deliberate. Slow. Steady. As if something was pulling her forward. And as she reached the door, she paused. The air around her grew colder. Frost formed on the edges of the wood. The whispers swelled. And then, a sound that wasn't a sound at all. The door slammed open. And the darkness beyond it swallowed her whole. There was no scream. No cry for help. Just the suffocating silence. And the whispers? Always the whispers. And somewhere, deep within the house, Martha's voice joined them. Together they whispered to the world outside. "You will know soon enough." The night stretched on, as if the darkness itself was waiting. The house stood silent, its walls cold and unyielding, yet alive with a presence that no one could explain. No one but those who had been here before. The figure, whoever they were, had long disappeared into the shadows, but the sense of their lingering power hung in the air like a curse. Inside the house, the temperature dropped again, biting at the skin. It felt as though the very walls were closing in. And in the kitchen, the knife still lay on the counter. Untouched. Silent. But the room was no longer still. The house had been abandoned, but its soul had never left. A flicker of light caught the corner of the room, then vanished. In the distance, the sound of footsteps could be heard. The soft shuffle of shoes against the wooden floor, dragging with unnatural slowness. A shadow moved through the house, just out of sight, leaving only the faintest trace of cold air in its wake. It wasn't human. Not anymore. At the edge of the room, a door creaked open. Slowly. Just a crack. And then it stopped. Martha's eyes opened. Her body twitched. Her hands curled into fists, but they were stiff. Slow. Her head turned toward the door, her breath shallow, ragged. She didn't remember how she got there. She didn't remember the fall. But she could feel something dark, calling her from beyond the threshold. Her feet moved before she could think, pulling her toward the open door. The whispers returned. Cold. Familiar. "You are not free." The voice, that same voice she had heard before, echoed in her mind. But this time, it was louder. Closer. She staggered forward, stepping into the hallway. The air was so thick, it felt like she was wading through it. The walls stretched inwards, as though the house itself were alive, watching her. The cold cut deeper, and the whispers grew louder still. Her chest tightened, each breath harder than the last. The door at the end of the hall was wide open now. Beyond it, a faint light flickered. A shadow moved across the floor, but it wasn't a human shape. It was something else. Something ancient. Something waiting. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her legs carried her forward. She had to see. She had to know. As she crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. The room was pitch black, but she could feel the presence, thick and suffocating. The air was still. Deadly still. And then she saw it. A figure. Tall. Unmoving. It was not a person. It was something else. Something ancient and cursed. The figure turned slowly. And for the first time, she saw its face. It was her own. The same eyes. The same lips. But twisted. Familiar. And empty. "Welcome home," the voice said. Martha's body stiffened. The room darkened further, swallowing her whole. And then, nothing. The house was silent once again. But it wasn't truly empty. It never would be. The air inside the house had settled into a thick, suffocating silence. Martha's breath was shallow, her heart thudding in her chest. But it wasn't just her heart that was beating. There was something else in the house now. A presence that no longer lurked in the shadows, but stood before her, solid and unyielding. The figure, her own twisted reflection, remained still, its eyes locked with hers. The silence between them stretched, taut and heavy, as if the world itself had paused to watch. The whispers, which had once filled the room, faded away like an echo. And yet, their absence felt even more oppressive. Martha could feel the weight of time stretching, as if everything that had happened, everything that had brought her here, was converging in this moment. The figure before her smiled, but it was not a smile of warmth or recognition. It was a smile of inevitability. "You should have known," the figure said, its voice now both hers and not. It was as though the house had absorbed every part of her fear, every regret, and every secret. She had known, hadn't she? Somewhere deep down, she had always known. Martha wanted to speak, to scream, to fight back. But the words caught in her throat. She was paralyzed. Her body refused to move, her limbs stiff and unresponsive, as if bound by invisible chains. All she could do was stand there, trapped in her own reflection, unable to escape the horror that had become her reality. The figure stepped closer, its presence growing heavier with every passing second. She could feel the cold emanating from it, seeping into her skin, chilling her to the bone. And then, as if the house itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for far too long, the figure spoke again. "Now you belong to me." Martha's world tilted. Everything she had fought against, the dark, the terror, the bloodshed, came rushing at her, all at once. And then, just as the figure reached out for her, everything snapped into blackness. The house was silent once more. Empty. Cold. The wind outside had begun to pick up again, rattling the windows as if whispering its own secrets to the world. But there was no one left to hear. Martha Agnew, along with her reflection, her shadow, and the whispers that had haunted her, had disappeared from this world. And in their place, only darkness remained. The house stood as it always had, forgotten, waiting. Waiting for the next soul to enter. And the cycle would begin again,